They rejected her for being too tall, until a man taller still lifted her into love.
Mail-order bride rejected for being too tall, until a lumber baron taller still lifted her into love. Washington Territory, 1888. The steamer hissed as it docked to the small frontier landing, rope snapping taut and gangplank lowering to the planks of the wharf. Dust swirled where townsfolk gathered, their Sunday best creased from sitting in church pews, before drifting here for the spectacle of a bride's arrival. Margaret Hale stepped down with her back straight, her gloved hand resting on the polished rail. Her figure rose above the bonnet women, above many of the men too, her height unmistakable. Conversation faltered. Eyes slid over her like weights, measuring, whispering. She met their stares without flinching, chin lifted, carriage unbending. She had crossed half a continent for a husband she had never seen. She would not shrink now. At the edge of the platform stood Thomas Whitfield, the storekeeper who had written her letters. He was smaller than she had imagined, compact, his shoulders narrow beneath his coat. His eyes widened, color flooding his cheeks. He stepped forward, then back, stammering, "Miss Hale." His voice cracked against the curious hush. Margaret inclined her head with poise. "Mr. Whitfield." For a moment silence stretched between them, her dignity set against his unease. Then his jaw clenched, and with a sharp shake of his head he thrust the ticket for her trunk into her hand. "I was misled about proportions," he muttered, the word falling hard into the air. A gasp ran through the onlookers, followed by a rustle of whispers. Whitfield turned on his heel, leaving her standing alone, the ticket trembling in her gloved fingers. The telegraph key inside the station clacked out its coded chatter, a relentless reminder that the world judged and recorded without pause. Margaret inhaled deeply. She would not plead, nor lower her gaze to follow him in walking away. She tightened her hold on her valise, her spine long and straight as a sapling growing toward the sun. "My name is Margaret Hale," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the crowd like a bell rung true. "And I stand as I am." The murmurs surged. A few women drew in their lips, eyes soft with pity. A few men smirked, their shoulders bent close in cruel amusement. The air pressed hot around her, thick with eyes that weighed her worth as though she were produce in a market stall. The boarding-house keeper bustled forward, hands flapping as though brushing away a nuisance. "Rooms are full," she declared too quickly. "No space for strays." Margaret opened her mouth to answer, but another presence stilled the woman's tongue. A shadow stretched across the planks beside Margaret, taller than any around her. Ephraim Carr stood like an oak at her side, his broad frame marked by quiet authority. His eyes were level, his face composed as though carved from stone. He addressed the boarding-house keeper with courtesy sharpened into command. "A private room. Tonight." Coins glinted in his palm, heavy enough to silence protest. The woman swallowed, bobbed her head, and shuffled back toward the inn. Margaret turned, her breath catching as she took in the man's unusual height, his steadiness. He removed his hat with grave respect, bowing slightly. "Miss Hale," he said, his tone low but carrying. "You owe me nothing. The room is yours. I interfere no further." From his coat pocket he drew a card, thick and plain. "Should you require assistance, this will find me." He tipped his hat once more and withdrew, leaving her with only the faint echo of his boots on the dusty boards. He had not stared at her height, nor winced at her difference. He had simply given room where it was refused. The boarding-house chamber was narrow, the ceiling low enough that Margaret felt the press of it on her spirit. Yet it was hers for the night, bought without bargain. She placed her trunk against the wall, sat at the small desk, and lit the lamp. Its flame wavered against the pale wallpaper, shadows trembling. She drew out stationery and dipped her pen, the scratch of ink steady against the hush. To the agency. She wrote of arrival and rejection, not cloaking the humiliation yet not surrendering to it. The groom declined on sight. She wrote with precision, citing my stature. "I do not petition for another, nor will I disguise the truth. I am Margaret Hale, and I decide what becomes of me." A second letter she composed to her younger sister back east. This one bore more warmth, though it held no rage. She described the dockside, the faces that measured her like a curiosity, the swift abandonment. Yet she ended not in despair but in resolve. "I will not crumple," she promised in looping script. "Do not fear for me. I am standing, and I shall remain so." The pen blotted once at the end, and she pressed her name firm across the page. "Margaret Hale, Standing. She set the letter aside, extinguished the lamp, and lay upon the narrow bed. Through the thin wall, the town murmured and shifted, its voices carrying judgment she could not still. Yet her breath came evenly, her heart steady. She had not been chosen, but neither had she been broken. Somewhere beyond the night's veil, the lumber baron's shadow lingered in her memory, a man taller still, who had looked at her not with disdain but with sober respect. She did not yet know what it meant, but she closed her eyes with the knowledge that she had kept her name, her bearing, her vow. And in the silence that followed, she felt the truth root itself within her like a seed that would not die. She was still standing. Margaret did not send for a ticket home. She woke each morning to the clang of wagons on the street and the scent of boiled coffee from the kitchen below, and instead of retreating eastward she walked the town in search of honest work. At the seamstress's shop she was measured by eyes sharper than needles, the proprietor fretting aloud that customers would balk at a model taller than their husbands. At the schoolhouse, the children craned their necks in open or before the schoolmarm whispered that a woman who loomed so might unsettle the pupils' discipline. At the general store, the clerk's stool creaked beneath her frame, and the owner's pursed lips closed around the word unsuitable before it was ever spoken. Margaret endured it all with her chin level, her gaze steady, never raising her voice nor allowing her pride to fracture. Every rejection was another stone in the wall that tested her resolve, but she met each one with a dignity that would not bend. On the third morning, a knock sounded at the boarding-house door. Ephraim Carr stood there with his hat in hand, sunlight glancing off the broad plane of his shoulders. He did not linger in the shadows nor lower his eyes in apology. His voice was calm, unhurried. "Miss Hale," he said, "I offer not rescue but employment. The mill office keeps ledgers that want order. The figures are clean, the pay is fair, and the door has a lock you may close behind you." His words were plain, absent of flattery or pretense. He added, with a gravity that left no space for misunderstanding, "This is not courtship. Not yet. It is work, and work alone, if you choose it." Margaret held his gaze, measuring not his stature but his candor. The terms honored her choice, and so she accepted. For the first time since stepping off the steamer, she felt that her decision was her own. The mill office smelled of resin and pencil shavings, the air threaded with sawdust from the yard beyond. Sunlight cut through high windows, illuminating ledger books stacked in leaning towers. Margaret took her place at the desk, her posture erect, pen poised with the assurance of one who refused to be diminished by numbers or by stares. Ephraim moved through the space with a practiced stoop, ducking beneath doorframes too low for his frame. She smiled faintly at the sight, confessing in a quiet moment that she had knocked the crowns from mantel clocks more than once in her father's parlor back east. He chuckled low, admitting he had tired long ago of the same jokes about rafters and ceilings. Between columns of sums, they traded truths like small coins, unadorned, genuine. He discovered that she read accounts as if they were maps to a future, tracing patterns of prosperity and failure with quick insight. She discovered that he wrote letters to the families of his crews with careful script, ensuring every widow and mother knew their sons and husbands were not forgotten. When laughter came, it was not bright and showy but quiet and real, warming the room like the low burn of a hearth that needs no tending to keep its glow. Outside the office, the storekeeper who had cast her aside did not forget her presence. In the churchyard, his voice slid like oil between parishioners, soft and insinuating. "A woman so tall will rule any man," he murmured, feigning regret. The words took root in the corners of conversation, watered by curiosity. Margaret heard them carried back to her in glances and raised brows, yet she chose not to chase them down. Ephraim too heard, but he did not answer with thunder. Instead, he answered with conduct. He made no late calls to the boarding-house, no whispered promises in shadows, no gestures that could be mistaken for anything less than respect. When he escorted her from the office door to the street, he did so with a pace that matched hers, his hand never presuming, his courtesy plain for all to see. It was Margaret herself who set the sharper line. One afternoon, as the town busybody leaned in with a smirk, commenting that a woman of such stature must grow weary of looming, Margaret stopped her with a single sentence. "My height," she said evenly, "is not an invitation." The words were cool, firm as stone, and the woman faltered, her smirk dissolving. Margaret returned to her work without further acknowledgment, her resolve unshaken. She wrote figures into the ledgers, her script steady, her purpose intact. Each sum balanced was another step into the life she had chosen, not the life chosen for her. By degrees, the whispers lost their edge, for whispers cannot thrive where dignity meets them head-on. Margaret kept her place in the office, Ephraim kept his distance without coldness, and together they built a rhythm that was neither spectacle nor secret. In the quiet tally of days, respect grew like timber seasoned in silence, its strength visible not in declarations but in the simple, unyielding grain of character. The investor came from the east with polished boots and a watch chain that gleamed every time he flicked it across his vest. He toured Ephraim's mill with narrowed eyes, tapping figures into a notebook, muttering about yield and freight. At supper that evening, in the boarding-house parlor where he lodged, he leaned forward with the certainty of a man who believed himself shrewd. Stability, he said, is half perception. A mill run by a married man reads solid on paper. Investors rest easier with wives in the ledger. His voice dripped with calculation, as if a woman's presence were merely another column of numbers. Ephraim listened in silence, jaw-taut. He did not argue, nor did he assent. When the investor departed, he went to his sister's modest home on the ridge and found her darning stockings by lamplight. They would have me barter a veuve for coin, he told her. But if I ask a woman to share my name, it will be for her sake, and mine, not for a balance sheet. Later, with his foreman, he repeated the same, his voice steady. I build mills from timber, not from false appearances. The foreman, who had labored under Ephraim's fairness for years, nodded once. They understood each other. For Ephraim Carr, love could not be bought nor leveraged. Margaret, meanwhile, had been sketching quietly on scrap paper in the mill office, her pen scratching out an idea born of memory. She had seen the children of the yard workers idling in dust, their mothers weary, their fathers too tired for evening tales. She thought of her father's shelves back east, the worn spines that had shaped her mind. With tidy columns she drafted a plan for a lending shelf, no more than a cupboard in the mill office stocked with books, primers, stories, manuals, that families could borrow freely. She handed the paper to Ephraim without flourish, expecting little more than his polite nod. But he read it carefully, lips tightening not in doubt but in thought. At length he said, "There will be an open house at the new log pond. Families will attend. President there." Margaret blinked, uncertain. "You mean, speak of it." He nodded. "It is your idea. Let them hear it from you. I will give you the platform. Then I'll step back." She searched his face for irony but found none. Her measure of him would be taken as much as the town's measure of her. And she agreed, because his trust asked her to stand tall, not for height's sake but for worth. The day of the open house dawned with a clear sky, the mill yard alive with laughter, boots, and the scent of pitch. Wagons lined the fence, families spilled out in their best clothes, and the investor himself loitered near the foreman, notebook in hand. Margaret stood beside the platform with her notes, her pulse quick but her back steady. Ephraim gestured her forward, then stepped aside, folding his arms as if to mark the stage as wholly hers. Yet when she moved to mount the steps, her skirt balked against the span between yard and platform. It was narrow enough for a nimble hop, but too wide for dignity in the layered cloth she wore. She hesitated. Before murmurs could rise, Ephraim bent slightly, his voice pitched only for her. "May I?" The question hung, simple and solemn. Margaret met his gaze, weighed the eyes upon them, and gave the smallest nod. With care that startled even her, he placed his hands at her waist and lifted her as one might set a child gently into a wagon seat. No spectacle, no display, just a motion done with respect, and her own hands resting for balance on his shoulders. He did not hurry, and when she stood upon the platform, he stepped back immediately, leaving her alone before the crowd. The hush that followed was not mockery but something nearer awe. Margaret drew in breath, squared her shoulders, and began. She spoke of books, of children who deserved stories, of workers who might find knowledge as vital as bread. She spoke of a town tall enough to look every one of its people in the eye. By the time she finished, the air felt charged not with whispers but with agreement. Ephraim's face in the crowd was unreadable, but his eyes glimmered with quiet pride. That evening, as the day's clamor faded into crickets and distant saw blades stilled, Margaret sat on the porch of the boarding-house. The lamplight spilled yellow on the planks, and the smell of pipe smoke lingered from passers-by. Ephraim came and stood by the rail, hat in hand, silent for a long moment before he spoke. "The first thing that startled me," he said, "was not your height. It was the way you refused to bend when others would have shamed you." His voice carried no embellishment, only truth. Margaret looked at him, her hands folded in her lap. "And I," she said softly. Took note of your height last of all. What I saw first was your gentleness. The words hung between them, not hurried, not heavy, but true. Neither promised more than they could keep, and yet neither denied the path laid open before them. They sat in that silence, the night air thick with unspoken possibility. The road between them was no longer one of mere courtesy. It had bent, subtly but unmistakably, towards something more.